This is Troy Brennan. He's Executive Vice President and Chief Medical Officer from CVS Health. And formerly of Aetna, is that correct?
That's right.
Yes. So that means that you really understand this issue from multiple perspectives as a physician, as an insurer, and as somebody from the PBM, or from the pharmacy benefits perspective, right? So that's great. And then we have Jennifer Bryant. She's a Senior Vice President from the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. So she is going to represent sort of the brand name drugs perspective. We have Steve Pearson, who is President of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, or ICER, which is a really interesting organization that does, I think, what the kind of thing that Richard would suggest the government should do in its negotiation, which is to look at drugs and decide what their value is and how that value relates to costs. And then finally, we have Rachel Sachs, Associate Professor of Law, Washington University School of Law, who is an expert on all things FDA, at least, on top of other expertise as well. So she can at least speak to the FDA issues. Okay, great. Let me start with sort of big picture in terms of the scope of the problem. Richard Frank said that he thinks that the markets in Part D work pretty well, except for a small number of cases where insurers and consumers, have little incentive to care about prices. I think other people might say that the scope of the problem is much bigger, that prices are just way too high throughout the system, and that we need a larger approach to, larger than a sort of surgical approach to dealing with the problem of high prices. I'm going to go down the road and see what is your perspective on sort of how big is this problem and where does it really lie?
Bigger than the 10 or 12 drugs that were on their table, I guess. Yeah, it wasn't my major contention with the paper, but I think you make a good point that it's broadly seen as a much wider thing that we have to address.
How about you, Jenny?
I think the challenge with going after a small handful of drugs, the 10 or 12 drugs that he characterized, is that it kind of misses the point that the entire R&D enterprise rests on the very small number of successful medicines. So if you do that, it sends a signal to the entire industry, and sends a chill into investment incentives. That said, I also think that there's a misunderstanding about the size and scale of the problem related to drug costs and spending. Healthcare costs are a problem. Drug costs are a piece of that. There's a lot that can be done to reduce prescription drug costs, but if you open the newspaper, you would think that prescription drug costs are exploding, literally, and are going to eat the whole healthcare budget, but all of the best estimates show that spending is going to grow about 4 to 7% per year. Healthcare costs are growing about 6% per year. That's not acceptable. We need to reduce it. There are lots of things we can do, but it's not an exploding, unsustainable crisis. And so we need to make sure we don't have rash solutions, but that we go after the niches that Fiona was talking about.
Steve?
So I guess when I talk with states and private purchasers and employers, I mean, they do have an experience of kind of having to look at the big picture and the pie, and to them over the past several years, it has been drug costs, especially specialty drugs, that seem to be the component that they feel like is both growing faster, but also that they just don't have the levers that they thought they might have to control it. So there's the spending that kind of makes people pivot and look at the issue. And then what they find is a lot of what was discussed earlier, which is it's really hard to figure out when we're getting a good value for a drug and when we're getting ripped off, when the value just doesn't seem to align with it. We know that it seems to be really random and all over the map. Our reports themselves have found some areas where we find virtually every drug in that area relatively well aligned with the added benefit to patients, which is the way that we talk about value, and others where literally every drug is somehow out of whack and much usually higher priced than you would assume if you were going to give it kind of a fair margin for that value. So even though I'm very attracted with the ideas I mentioned of figuring out a way to target and to focus on where the market seems to be working less well, I think it is a broader issue that a lot of patients are grappling with in a variety of different disease areas, but especially where there are those usually self-injectable drugs where sometimes the market incentives, again, as Richard, I think, pointed out quite well, there are areas where it seems to be just structurally, systematically difficult to get a fair deal for patients. And even the drug companies at our public meetings have complained. They say, we want to come to market with a lower priced drug. there are structural reasons that we have a hard time doing that as part of a competitive landscape. So there are some important problems.
How about you?
And one thing that I think is so wonderful about this conference is how complementary all of the papers are, right? So you've got, the Richard Frank paper saying, here's this particular set of high-cost branded drugs which are of concern. You've got Aaron and Tom saying, and this is also a particular problem for a set of generics. And then you've got Fiona's paper saying, actually, all across the industry, there are these particular ways in which competition isn't working to the degree that we're encouraging it. And so I don't know which of those is the biggest in terms of being a driver, but I do think they're all really important to the puzzle.
So I'm going to start with you again on the next set of questions. I'll come back. You don't all have to answer every question, but I want to ask some questions about the FDA. So we heard a lot of proposals for the FDA to do things differently this morning. And one question I have is, does the FDA have the right balance between worrying about safety and worrying about competition? And what is their mandate actually? And does the mandate fit what they should be doing?
I mean, if you ask 10 different academics, you'll get 20 different answers to this question because we all, it depends what I had for breakfast, how I'm feeling that day, who's the commissioner, things like that. And so I think the FDA has done an enormous amount over the last decade or two to really change the ways in which it reviews drugs. It's done an enormous amount to speed up the process for innovative new drugs for particular classes of drugs. And I think a lot of the rhetoric we hear today is really stuck in an older sense of the FDA that's very tied to a more rigid drug approval system than we actually have. So I think there's some value in allowing the systems we've just created as recently as a couple of years ago to really come to fruition and see how those actually work. But I think it's tough to say that we've created the platonic ideal of a drug approval system, right? It's tough to say what that would even be.
Does anybody else want to chime in on that?
I mean, generally speaking, the dynamic has been, sort of, are we getting the drugs out fast enough as the FDA holding things up? And with the whole Cures Act and things like that, I think I would personally be kind of where the Avorn-Kesselheim papers have been, which is that, we want to make sure that we can get all the drugs that we need, but these protections are very important, and we should be willing to sort of put up with some delays in order to make sure that patients aren't going to get injured. It goes back a little bit to Aaron's paper, though, on sort of importation. It's a good idea, from a PBM point of view. That's where you make your money, and PBM and retail pharmacies on generic medications, so the importation would be a good thing. But what you're really worried about is touching the third rail of getting very bad products coming in through a process like that. So I think those gentlemen have to be very, very confident. We'd have to all be very confident that we weren't missing the protections that the FDA brings to bear, because at least from the point of view, it's sort of like you go into your CVS store. We're utterly dependent on the FDA to certify that these medications are exactly what they're supposed to be. We don't do any of that work ourselves. And if there starts to be importation, I think we're going to get drawn into that.
And is the worry that sort of they had a very specific set where you said it's probably not a problem, but I guess the worry might be that once you went that route, then it's kind of a slippery slope, and perhaps then the demand for, well, why that country and not this country, or this drug and not that drug? Is that kind of what is the biggest impediment to that, or? Yeah,
I think that crooked people making bad drugs are amazingly innovative in terms of the ways in which they import those drugs, and the FDA's own presentations on this would suggest that things that look like they should be benign aren't. So I just think you have to be very careful, and I appreciate the fact that in both the first two papers, there was a relatively sort of narrow focus that was well supported academically.
Right.
The one thing I wanted to add.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think the FDA already has a really big job in assessing safety and efficacy. So I don't know that it's about adding to their mandate, but I do think that it's become clear that there are some places in the marketplace for older off-patent medicines and for generic medicines where there needs to be more competition, and that there are a combination of things that could be done through the FDA to either get first generic approvals through sooner, or to make it more attractive for first generics to enter. And so I think that ranges from things like technical assistance to make sure that there is adequate understanding of the manufacturing standards, to making sure that that there are other incentives. I think the range of them, some of the things that I think Erin and Tom dismissed might be worth actually looking at, but I think we're on the right track in sort of figuring out how to make it attractive to enter essentially a commodity market where if things go well, the prices should approach marginal costs. And like that's a very different kind of problem than the problem, the kinds of things we've talked about in the brand market, and there needs to be more policy attention community. I'd say it's the mandate of the policy community and the health plans to drive competition there, not the FDA.
You want to?
I was going to add, the FDA has an incredibly difficult job. The one thing, there are a couple things though, insofar as they have created new accelerated pathways through a variety of different ways to try to speed up and to foster innovation, if you will. And that's the good. The challenge is that now when drugs are approved, we really do know less and less about their clinical effectiveness, much less their comparative clinical effectiveness. And there are some things that the FDA, I think, could pay a little bit more attention to in terms of making sure that the way that outcomes are measured in the development trials are similar or exactly the same across different drugs, because that way patients and clinicians who are really going to be making decisions, as well as payers, can do a better job of trying to do indirect comparisons at the time of launch. And as far as the FDA has been evolving, we've done nothing to kind of create a tag-on or a bolt-on process for the first 2 or 3 years after approval. PCORI was often thought of as a potential kind of actor that would help us gain that kind of information. It really hasn't served that role. And so we are left...
what that is?
Pardon? Oh, sorry. PCORI is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute that was founded as part of the ACA. But for a variety of reasons, it hasn't done that kind of research, certainly much of it. So we're still left with drugs coming through around which we know less and less, and the pricing structure is still at launch. The company announces a price, and the market kind of reacts. So it's that part is starting to feel even more dysfunctional, I think, than it did a few years ago.
So let me ask you a question about FDA budgets. So we now use user fees to help sort of supplement any kind of budget that the FDA gets from the government. Is that a smart thing to do? Would the government actually end up saving money if FDA budgets were larger and the cost of entering were lower for generics and things could get approved quicker? Is this kind of make sense to starve the FDA? Is the FDA being starved? You know. Rachel?
I'll ask the easier version of what you just asked, because I think it's a genuinely tough question of how much do we want industry to be sharing in the costs. And I also study intellectual property law, where the PTO is almost entirely funded by applicants for patents. So I think there are arguments for and against it. I think the User Fee Act process itself leaves a lot to be desired, right? The fact that you have must-pass legislation every 5 years across all of these different topics really provides an opportunity for it to become a Christmas tree of different provisions of different kinds being added that really don't relate to the setting of the user fees themselves, but are gifts to particular constituents of various kinds. And so I think that process itself is not the ideal way to be doing this.
I mean, I would argue that the PDUFA process has actually worked incredibly well, and that it's led to shorter approval times, really quite dramatically, that it's improved consistency and predictability. And no process is perfect, but I think in the difficult fiscal environment we're in right now, the last thing we want to be doing is sort of completely blowing up the structure for funding the FDA, which still is the world gold standard in terms of drug approval. And I think we want to keep it that way.
Okay, let me move on. Let me talk about a little bit about what I opened the panel with this morning, which is this trade-off between the incentives for innovation and the desire to have lower prices. And let me actually just go back to, again, the Hatch-Waxman Act and ask about when that was introduced and when, if you make it easier for generics to enter, that effectively lowers the return on innovation, right? If you thought that it was very hard for generics to enter, then your patent sort of doesn't expire the way Fiona said with biosimilars. So I don't know what happened then, but was there the argument when this passed that this was a terrible idea because we were not going to get innovation that now has just been accepted as a reasonable thing? I mean, one of the interesting things in this area is I don't think there's a consensus on what the optimal length of time is, right? In terms of like, are the returns too small? Are they too big for innovation? I don't think there is a consensus. And so I'm just wondering whether or not there was sort of a view that allowing generics in was going to reduce innovation and was, not a good thing. Anybody know or remember? Yeah.
I mean, of course, I would defer to the author on this, but from, and if you want to answer, you can, but from my understanding, it was really a compromise, right? There were efforts to pass, well, so Hatch-Waxman did two things, right? It created a generic pathway, but it also provided for patent term restoration for a lot of these branded companies who lose time during the FDA approval process. And so it's really bringing together those two interest groups and saying we're going to give one thing to each party. And if I recall, there were efforts to pass either bill alone, and those had failed. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, if that was for procedural reasons, but it really was conceived of as a compromise, and I think that's all to the good.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to the history and way back when, but I think it's indisputable that the presence of this kind of system in which a patented drug goes off patent and the price falls, I think, actually often to 10% of what the branded cost is a huge force for savings. And one of the misconceptions, I would say, is that we've exhausted all of the savings from that system, because you'll hear a lot of people say, well, the patent cliff is over, and now we have a lot of medicines that are biologics, and we don't have biosimilars yet, so we don't have those savings. But actually, if you look at the projections of the number of drugs that are coming off patent in the next 5 years, the dollar value is more than over the last 5 years. So a lot of people are referring to the mini patent cliff, or the patent cliff 2.0 is happening now. And it's just a cycle. And there's huge ongoing savings, and biosimilars were just at the very beginning. The one thing I know for sure about the history is that no one in 1984 thought that we would get to a point where 90% of the prescriptions would be generic. That was actually not the expectation, I'm fairly confident. Or maybe you would have seen more objections to the time. But we're the early days for biosimilars, and I would argue that biosimilars are going to be a huge force for savings going forward, and we're just beginning to get the first inklings of that. In the parts of the market where insurers are making use of the first biosimilar for diabetes, we are seeing that in cases where it's been preferred, it has 50% market share. So I don't count the payers out, would be sort of my advice. Don't assume that biosimilars will just be, small discounts and that there will be slow take-up, because we have a very creative payer sector that is anxious for savings. So,
yeah, I agree with that, because I feel like very rarely do we payers get called creative. So, and I thought, Fiona was firing a lot of directions more at pharma than at the PBM, so I was happy about that. But with regard to this, when you ask for what's the major issue is getting the biosimilars out, because clearly the pipeline for pharma is in the biologics. The exciting things, as you see, are almost, even when they're relatively sort of small molecules and they're going to be taken orally, they're still going to be coming under biologics, and so we need to get more biosimilars out there. And once the biosimilars are out there, we will do a good job of it. We just took Lantus off of our major commercial formulary, and replaced it with Basaglar. Basaglar didn't come through the biosimilar pathway, but it's essentially a biosimilar. And we ended up replacing about 99% of the utilization of Lantus, and it's a much less expensive medication because we were able to get discounts in the form of rebates to reduce the costs associated with those. So I'm a strong believer, and I think that everyone in the industry can agree that the more biosimilars that we have available is going to be a very strong thing in terms of sort of reducing costs. Because Steve's point, those biosimilars come out, we're basically reducing the cost per quality adjusted discharge by simply decreasing the price that we have to pay for them.
Just one other point about this, because that life cycle is so different from what you see in other parts of the healthcare market, is that, I think everybody has acknowledged that there are savings, but what tends to be sort of taken for granted and not fully appreciated is that those savings sort of are cumulative and explode over multiple decades. So if you look back at like what happened with the development of statins for high cholesterol. At the time that they were new medicines, there was a lot of complaining about the costs in a sense that they were expensive. But there's been academic work looking back at those molecules. I think there's a Huskamp, Chernew, I'm forgetting some of the, McKellar, maybe it's the other author, looked at like 19 molecules and said that just those 19 molecules, if you looked at, the 20 years post the patent expiry, it produced like $400 billion in savings for consumers. So there's a huge consumer welfare surplus that happens at the end of that patent expiry. And you don't have that for hospitals. You don't have it for surgeries. You don't have it for physicians. So that's one reason that the pricing is so very different for prescription drugs.
One of the things I wonder that I haven't heard people talk, I mean, some of literally the smartest people I know work for pharmaceutical companies. They're smart scientists, they're smart business people. So they see biosimilars coming, and they're not dummies. So their corporate structure is based on a certain return on investment and revenue and profit margin, and it's very hard to leave that. So with biosimilars coming, if I were in their shoes, I would say, I better bring my prices up as quickly as possible so that 30% off looks like what I was hoping to get otherwise. Or I'd better do something else. But the business strategy doesn't go away. The search to use the existing legislative and regulatory framework to maximize the return. So even though I also think that competition is always better than no competition, I'm a little bit less sanguine that, again, that's partly because of our experience. If we just go back 4 or 5 years in the drugs for multiple sclerosis, their prices align well, according to our metric, with the added benefit to patients. Everything since then has been price increase on a year-on-year basis for the same drugs, so that now they're way out of that alignment. So I'm kind of curious whether we think, I'm asking you and maybe Troy too, but do you not anticipate some reaction from the innovator community to try to continue to make those profits one way or the other despite biosimilars?
Well, monopolies are monopolies and patents are monopolies, and so they have a lot of discretion over the pricing associated with the branded medications and with new launches. I think if you look at it a little bit sort of historically, what you had, if you go back to sort of 10 years ago, you had a lot of drugs that had come out through the physiological revolution that we had, including the statins, in the 80s and 90s, and those all were going off patent, and there was an expectation of a very reasonable profit margin at the pharmaceutical manufacturers. And so the only way you can really address that is either by increasing the prices on existing branded drugs or increasing the launch price. And that's basically sort of got set in place sort of in the 10-11 period of time. Even in 12, though, overall as a country, we had deflation in terms of the costs of medications because we had a lot of big drugs go off patent thanks to Hatch-Waxman. And saved the country a lot of money. But you really caught up with this increasing price in 14 and 15. And as a result, the PBMs have had to sort of up the game in order to try to reduce the costs overall for our clients and be a lot more stringent with regard to the use of formulary and things like that. But at least us and everybody else who reported that our clients saw about 12 to 15% increase as recently as 14 and 15. Now in 16 and 17, that's down in the sort of 2 to 3% range. So, be that as it may, the pricing and the fact that people face a lot of this pricing when they're in a deductible phase is just making for a system that doesn't seem to me like it can persist exactly the way it's persisting right now.
That's interesting. I'm just going to ask a question. So when you think about, if you're going to hit your deductible anyhow, in some sense you shouldn't care, but maybe people think they do. Like they still see this big number and it feels expensive, even if, it's February, you're going to hit your deductible and basically nothing, it costs you nothing at the margin or,
our own data and data that IMS publishes, we've published several papers on this, shows both that the walk-away rate from initial prescription increases about 20% when the medication is going to have a cost of over $90, and that people go off, stop taking their drug at a much higher rate when they face that kind of thing. And the sort of elasticity curve there seems to be somewhere between $90 and $120. And then after that, and look, a lot of these people are paying $3,000 or $4,000 for medications when they're in the deductible phase.
Yeah, I would love to pick up on that because one of the themes I think you heard earlier was that, people are, because of insurance or because of copay cards, people's cost sharing is reduced so far that they're insensitive to the cost. And I think actually that masks a lot of the real dynamics in the pharmaceutical market. So we've had a couple things happening simultaneously. There's been a growth in the rate of generic use, and generic cost sharing is very low. Payers are really skilled at driving use to the lowest cost therapies, right? So about a third of prescriptions, a quarter to a third, are free. Copay 0 for generics. So that's coming down, but the cost sharing for brands has been rising really rapidly. At the same time that you're seeing very large growth in high deductible health plans. And the way the cost sharing works for patients who are taking a brand in the deductible is their cost sharing is tagged to the list price, which is not actually the price that the insurer is paying. And in the case of an insulin, for example, that list price might be twice the price that the insurer is paying. So you're charging patients an artificially inflated price in the deductible, and you're taking the year's worth of cost sharing and cramming it all into January. So what does that mean? It means that for the small number of patients who are taking really expensive medicines, their cost sharing is going through the roof. So it's very bimodal. You have like lots of people who don't have any problems because they're taking generics, it's going down. And then you have a small group of the sickest patients who are facing rapidly rising cost sharing. And so that averages to, it's been about flat. But that's sort of the old joke about averages, right? So
I just had one point on that. In the murky world of sort of rebates, we offer to clients, what were called point of service rebates, point of sale rebates. So basically, like for our 250,000 people at CVS, you get the rebate deducted at the time that you pay at the pharmacy itself. And I think we're going to see more people interested in that because, traditionally the rebates travel right back to the employer, and then the employer decides what to do with the rebates. But as the deductible increases, more people are beginning to sort of see that it's important to have the rebate deducted at the time of sale.
Just one more point here about why drugs are different from hospitals that I think is just worth keeping in mind. If you have a hospitalization, you need to get hospital care, and you show up in January, and the cost of that care is going to exceed your deductible, or maybe you're out of pocket for the year. You work out a deal with the hospital, you get your care, and you pay it out over 12 months. No problem, right? If you can't pay it, the hospital wipes it off. It's bad debt. They're a hero, and they get a tax credit. If you have a drug that you need that's going to put you over your out-of-pocket, you show up at the pharmacy in January. What do? How many families have $5,000 in a savings account ready to pay for a drug in January? They don't have it. So we've taken all of that cost sharing and put it into January. And if the pharmaceutical company offers you a cost sharing assistance, a copay card, we're going to consider them a villain for having done an end run around the benefit design, or else the patient doesn't get their care. So I think we need to rethink how we're characterizing this and what's, I understand that there are a lot of nuances here, but essentially we have to make it possible for people to survive in high deductible plans and to get through the first few months of the year. And I think we're past the point at which we can say all cost-sharing coupons are just kickbacks. I think we have real problems in affordability, and patients are needing help, and manufacturers are trying to respond.
That's really interesting. I never really thought about this idea of this smoothing through the year, but that makes a lot of sense. That'd be very difficult for a patient. Let me talk about rebates again, because the role of rebates is just confusing to me, frankly. And there's different rebates going to the consumer, not going to the consumer. And why are rebates such a big part of this industry? And Fiona was talking about the benefits of hidden rebates, and I don't quite understand that well. And I was wondering if you could explain.
Well, I thought that was a mistake on Fiona's part, but she might disagree with me on that. Rebates are very transparent to the people who are actually paying for the pharmaceutical benefit. That is the insurers or the employers that we have as our major clients. And they can do it several different ways. They can go through a completely transparent approach, and have the rebates go directly to them, and we're just paid fees, and never touch the rebate. We can do situations in which we say we'll guarantee this amount of rebate, and then above, if we get more rebates than that, then we both share in the amount, and that's how there are some retained rebates. But if we look overall at sort of the ways in which we reduce costs, sort of what we do as a PBM, and we have all this on our website, the rebates are actually a relatively small portion of the overall decreases, but they make good sense. When Sovaldi's out there and it's the only hepatitis C drug, it's a situation where it's a single source brand, and that's a pure patent monopoly. There's nothing we're going to do about that. When Harvoni comes out and Vicera comes out, AbbVie and Gilead, it gives us a great sort of bargaining situation. And so we're able to sort of have the cost. Now, I'm not revealing what our rebates were, but anybody can go on to the Medicaid website and find out what Medicaid best price is, and it reflects the best rebating that's available. So the reason why we don't talk about them sort of publicly, exactly like Fiona said, because we feel like that there may be sort of competitive loss as a result of doing that. But that when we basically did a deal with the manufacturers of Basaglar and moved patients off of Lantus onto Basaglar, the manufacturers of Lantus immediately go and offer a much steeper rebate to ESI. ESI, us, Optum, we're in sort of cutthroat competition that's based almost completely on price with employers and insurers who are backed up by very sophisticated consultants. So they all know exactly sort of what's going on in the rebating situation. So, the fact that rebates are murky, they're murky to people who are sort of outside the industry, but most people in the industry understand them pretty well.
Well, can I just I think that there's a huge amount of negotiation that's going on, and I think we would agree that the PBMs are really fierce negotiators and do a good job. The result of that, though, is that net prices after accounting for rebates for prescription drugs, net prices went up last year about 2.8%. The problem with rebates is largely that the entire public debate is about the list price, which is not the price that anyone actually pays, right? That's the problem, I think, is that we're having a public discussion that's not, we talk about reading and prices, all of the things you read are essentially about the list price, not about the net price, because if you look at Choi's earning calls, they're suggesting that, a third of their customers had decreases in spending last year. And, their net spending is about 2 to 3%, right? And if that was clear to most people, we wouldn't be having the huge amount of furor about prescription drug prices, I think, because that 2 to 3% includes all of the new orphan drugs, all of the fancy cancer medicines, all of the generics, all of the biologics without yet having biosimilar competition. So I think that's essentially the problem. And it's not that we should make it public either, because we would also agree that, and I think it was said earlier, full disclosure of prices would actually lead to compression of rebates and higher costs. So we have to, as a system, work toward a more sensible discussion about what's really happening on net trends.
I could ask you a million questions and keep this going forever, but I'm going to open it up to audience questions. We have mics coming around. If you have a question, raise your hand, stand up and tell us where you're from, please. Let's see, right here? Right there, raise your hand.
Yeah, I'm Carl Polzer, and I started a project that's trying to promote greater economic inclusion and equity. And my question is, for nursing homes and hospitals, we've tried productivity adjustments through administrative pricing. And none of the talk here is about the administrative pricing. I guess that's off limits. But could you do something that would encourage a little more productivity, like have a shorter patent for Medicaid? So in other words, subtract a year or two from the patent time if you sell to low-income populations. So there would be more competition. Or is there something we can do with the patent system to calibrate it?
I mean, I think one way of asking that question different ways, are the patents too long, right? Does anybody think that the patent, are too long?
I mean, unfortunately, even if the answer is yes, the response is sort of too bad. There's not a lot we can do about that under international law. So There are certainly steps we can take to reduce things like secondary patents and the grants of secondary patents for some of these products, but it is really, really tough to use patents as a lever for improving access. We can use other tools, many, many other tools, but patents, I think, have for most of academics not really been on the list.
I would just say it's a creature of our law, in some ways, patent law, and there are articles. Erin's been writing about this. My daughter's been writing about this when she was at the Yale Law School, about the fact that there are situations with the government basically sort of walk-ins and invalidates the patent. And there's been proposals that have been raised about that. For instance, hepatitis C in prisons. Do we really, do we have to have sort of absolute respect for the patent law sort of throughout? Or should we be treating all these people at low cost in prison? From a public health point of view and from an equity point of view, that would be an excellent thing to do because there's such a huge reservoir of hepatitis C infections. But I think for now, those views are seen as relatively sort of radical, but it just reminds us that, sort of in this particular area, if people can't afford their medication, all bets are off in terms of sort of where the government might go.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Again, I'm Jordan Sellers. I'm a student at Howard University. I'm curious to know, really, in what we were just talking about, is there a way to explain healthcare from the perspective of saying white people are not getting their industry needs met and they'll shop for a private healthcare plan as opposed to something that they can go and compete for this market that really says white people aren't going to benefit from that? And I don't know if anyone can answer that question, but I'm just curious that white people are going to start looking at the industry and how healthcare is being taught and maybe take their healthcare and privatize it.
So I guess I'm a little confused. So you're talking about, so most people do have private health insurance.
So the idea is that there's always government intervention in terms of public policy and like where we're going to go with like this whole debate recently about healthcare. But we're starting to see social scientists report that white people are basically saying there is no government public policy that's going to solve healthcare for those people. And white people are saying that, the trend is now showing in social science that they're going to privatize their own healthcare and say, you know what, look at what we just did currently, and like they keep bringing up healthcare again. So maybe it is a public policy question. I'm just curious, and maybe white people are sitting there saying the government is not going to really regulate healthcare.
Well, I think, Part D is a good example of sort of what you're talking about, where it's basically sort of a government program, but it's administered largely by private firms. And certainly it's solved a real problem in terms of making medications available for the elderly under the Medicare benefit. I would go back to the paper that Richard and Richard presented, since it was fascinating, and just note that there's a major assumption there that when there's a lot of reinsurance available, 85% reinsurance or 80% reinsurance with only 15% of private firms, that the private firms are just basically going to sort of back off and accept higher cost medications. But I think that's a good view from an academic point of view, and I was an academic for 20 years, but actually every little bit of profit makes a difference to a for-profit firm, and so you're not going to give up on that 15% you've got there. And in fact, the drugs that are listed in their table, the loss ratios associated with those are all over 200%, which means that basically almost anybody who's using those medications is costing the overall plan money. So it's actually just the opposite of what they would infer, which is that, often I'm the one, as the doctor, sort of recommending what is a high-priced drug, because I say this is a matter of the sort of standard of care. It has to be on the formulary. And the people who are running the program saying, do we really need to have this drug on? Optum doesn't have this drug on. ESI doesn't have this drug on. So Acthar is a great example. No need for that medication really to be on, from my point of view, to be on a Part D therapy, but it's in a protected class for MS, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you don't put it on your formulary, the government's going to force it on the formulary. So I think that, if you take that assumption out, I think a little bit of it starts to sort of fall apart in terms of the overall MSIC analysis. I'm lucky that they're not on the panel up here to debate that.
And just to add really quickly to that, I mean, there are enormous equity questions here about access to care, access to insurance. So I think we would all have to say that if there were particular conditions which were more prevalent among the uninsured population than among other populations, it would be tough to justify investing in new drugs for those diseases as a business proposition if the patients can't afford them. And so my background is in access to medicines and global health. I take that really seriously, and I think it's one concern many of us have about the way the system leaves out groups of people on race, gender, class lines.
And just to build on that, I think one thing that's just worth noting, again, about how prescription drugs are different is that prescription drug spending is really persistent year over year, right? So if you have high drug spending this year, you're likely to have high drug spending next year. That's actually not so much true with hospitalization. If you get hospitalized this year, you might not next year. And that's another thing to keep in mind when we think about the sensitivity of patients to costs for prescription drugs. If you take the case of someone who's got a chronic illness like diabetes, they could be spending quite a lot on medicines this year and next year and every year without ever actually meeting their full deductible or their out-of-pocket costs. And so one of the problems for patients is that their sort of lifetime costs are so much higher with chronic disease because they're taking medicines year after year. And that does contribute to disparities in health outcomes. And you see that underuse of treatment for, among vulnerable populations is much more severe. And that's another indication, I think, that cost sharing is a real problem and that we do need to worry about patient affordability. But again, we have to think about it not just sort of in a blunt average, but think about it for the patients who are really suffering year after year, and also for patients that are taking specialty medicines and where we're asking them to pay too much at one point in time, and we really need to be able to spread it out.
The back, I think the last question we have time for.
Thank you very much for giving me the last question. I'm Lauren Hershey. I was a guest scholar here 30 years ago, but the subject was telecommunications. Said that earlier. I want to thank Brookings very much for what you're doing. I'd like to take you up on the last point that you mentioned about diabetes and being on the medication protocol, if you will. I understand that there are some people who are able to find a way to leave that protocol. So my question is, for the industry and for the scholars and for the academics, is anybody looking at the incentives that are created for individuals to cease taking medications and finding whatever alternative pathway there is? I'm not advocating anything. I'm just very curious about the point. I know several people who have faced that dilemma.
Well, with type 2 diabetes, the critical thing is to lose weight. And if you lose weight, you can go off the medications.
So do high co-payments
Are there
for
any
diabetes
studies
medication
done on that?
leads to weight loss?
No. No, I think you had the causal chain in the wrong direction there. But, to be serious, I think that most people, I'm an internist, and, most of my patients who have chronic disease are going to stay on their medications. Pharma's come out with some great drugs recently. Hepatitis C is a great example, perhaps never a more successful drug in terms of reduction of morbidity and mortality, actual cures. But most people are going to be on their medications, and I think that those of us who are involved in this industry have got to figure out how we're going to make those affordable to people who have these chronic diseases.
Great. Well, that's a great place to end. I want to thank the panel so much for being here. It was great.